Hello and welcome back to Biology for Beginners. This week we're going to be tackling all of Chapter 6, and we're going to be talking about cellular respiration and a little bit about fermentation at the end. As always, before we begin, you are seeing our terms and definition slides popping up so that you can either pause the video and grab the necessary vocabulary to understand the concepts we're talking about, or you can pop on over to my Patreon and grab the PDF of my slideshow for absolutely free the day the video releases, or patrons get this video as well as the slides and any other study material that I have made to go with the Bio for Beginners videos an entire day early. More or less an entire day, but it will be the date early. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I know that some videos have not happened in the last week or so. Well, I am still a full-time college student, so sometimes life happens and videos don't get made, but we will be picking back up on that here in the next few days. So hopefully everything should be back to normal. And without further ado, let's get into cellular respiration. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of cellular respiration, let's kind of talk about the overall energy needed for life. So in the image here, we have kind of a cycle showing photosynthesis at the top and cellular respiration at the bottom. Now, photosynthesis occurs in plants, algae, some protists, and prokaryotes. And as we all know, it takes the light energy and converts it to chemical energy with carbon dioxide and water going in and oxygen coming out as the waste product. Now, kind of forget that I mentioned photosynthesis. We're not going to talk about it again through this entire video, but next chapter we are tackling photosynthesis, so be ready for that. Cellular respiration, on the other hand, happens in most cells. So whether you're a plant that photosynthesizes or a person that cannot convert light energy into chemical energy, cells are probably going to do cellular respiration. Now, there is some exceptions to that rule in certain cell types and I believe some other prokaryotes, but we're not talking about them because we're talking about cellular respiration. And so basically what cellular respiration does, it takes that energy in food and converts it to usable energy for cellular work. And as opposed to photosynthesis, oxygen goes in and then carbon dioxide and water are the waste products of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration can be summed up by the equation C6H12O6 plus 6O2 gets converted to 6CO2 plus 6H2O and ATP and heat. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful and it seems a bit scary, but let's break it down a little bit. So O2 is oxygen, CO2 carbon dioxide, H2O water. ATP we've talked about before, that's adenosine triphosphate. That is the molecule that is essentially the energy bank for cellular work. And then heat is heat. Now, C6H12O6 is glucose, which is a sugar. It is going to be the most basic sugar for life, essentially. And we have talked about sugars and carbohydrates in previous videos when we were talking about the molecules for life. So cellular respiration is an aerobic process, which means it requires the presence of oxygen, or that O2, which is why O2 is so important in that equation that we have right at the top of the slide. And then, as you can see, CO2 is released as a waste product. And that's what you can see on the right side of that equation. And basically what happens is all of that energy that's stored in those bonds of glucose that was made by the photosynthesizers can then be released and then converted and stored in the bonds in ATP so it can be used by the cell. Because while that energy is in the glucose bonds, it's not usable by the cell. It needs to be in the bonds of ATP to be able to be used for the cell to carry out everything that a cell does. and up to 32 ATP molecules will be produced for each glucose molecule. So keep that in mind as we kind of go through the stages of cellular respiration. Everything that we're seeing to count the ATP is per glucose molecule, which will make more sense as we get later on in the video. A quick little aside before we continue with cellular respiration is a human connection for energy and all that jazz. So the book that I am following likes to do these human connection slides because it is for non-bio majors. So it makes sense to kind of connect what we're talking about to more everyday life kind of things. So how do we measure this energy that cells are getting, that your body is using? We use a thing called a kilocalorie, or kcal. And a kcal is 1,000 calories with a lowercase c, and that is important. But what exactly is a kilocalorie? Well, it's the amount of heat that it takes to raise the temperature of 1 kilogram of water by 1 degree Celsius. And yes, we're using a lot of metric system stuff because science is done in the metric system, because the metric system makes sense and America is wrong. But the important thing here is that 1 kilocalorie, you all have seen this. And the reason you've seen this is because if you take any food package near you and you notice the amount of calories with that capital C there, 1 calorie with the capital C is 1,000 little calories. So 1 capital C calorie, 1,000 lowercase c calories. And the reason that the food companies do this is because as consumers, it's a lot less scary for us to see that is 95 calories, not 95,000 calories. So kind of keep that in mind, but that's not to scare you. That's just kind of how they do that. And then we have a little figure here of how many kilocalories are going to be consumed per hour based on different activities that a human does. But we're going to move on here. There's more that we could get into with how they label food and the different amounts that go into all of that for different molecules that you get from that, but that's not really important here. This is just a little aside, and I do think that it is important to understand the big C calorie is 1,000 little c calories, or 1 kilocalorie. How exactly is this energy captured by the process of cellular respiration for cells to be able to use and for us to have the energy to power everything we do? Well, it's through a couple of different things, and basically at the core is going to be the chemical reactions that take place. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the redox reactions. And redox reactions are these reactions that happen because of pairing oxidation with reduction. And now those are big chemistry words that sound scary, but let's take a step back and kind of break them down. At the core of a redox reaction, you have the transfer of electrons or hydrogen, because our book mentions hydrogen as well, from one molecule to another. Now, if you're taking a chemistry class, they will get more in depth with oxidation numbers and more of what is happening, but for this, we're not going to get that in depth. The big picture here when you're talking about cellular respiration is kind of understand that electrons are being transferred from one molecule to another. So the oxidation part is the part of this whole process that is losing the electrons or losing hydrogen. And when you lose hydrogen, you lose it as an H+, so you actually lose a hydrogen ion. And then reduction is where you're gaining electrons or the hydrogen. So if we look at the figure, which is, in my opinion, a little confusing to look at when you're talking about oxidation and reduction, but the other figure the book had was just as confusing, so we're going to go with this one. So on the left side, we're seeing some sort of oxidized fuel. And what happens here is you see that it loses the 2H plus and the 2 electrons. And then that then gets added to a molecule that we will talk about a little more in depth in future slides. But this NAD plus is then reduced to NADH as it is reduced by gaining those electrons in one of the H plus ions. So at the end, you have the NADH reduced molecule plus a hydrogen ion kind of hanging out around there. So again, we had some sort of oxidized fuel, lost the electrons and the hydrogen ions, and then we had NAD plus reduced to NADH. But the other important part of this energy capture whole process happens after NADH holds on to those electrons, because those electrons are then taken to something called the electron transport chain. And basically what the electron transport chain does is it allows these electrons to travel through a chain of different carrier molecules in the membrane system. And at the end of everything, ATP is released, and the cell then has the necessary molecule to carry out work in other parts of the cell. And this all happens in the mitochondria. It's a little bit different for prokaryotes, but we don't care about them. We're eukaryotes. We're talking about cells with mitochondria. So again, that NAD plus accepts the electrons to become NADH, which is the reduced form. Those electrons are carried and travel through a chain of other carrier molecules so that at the end, ATP can be released. We'll talk a little bit about that in a little more detail in a few minutes here. And then at the end, you also have the H plus, so those hydrogen ions, electrons, and oxygen create water as a waste product. So let's get a little bit more into the actual stages of cellular respiration now that we kind of get an idea of how that energy is captured. What we're looking at here is a kind of diagram that depicts the different stages, and you can kind of see what products are coming out from where. But if we zoom out of that diagram a little bit here, that blue stage is going to be the first stage, the thing that kicks off cellular respiration, which is called glycolysis. And basically glycolysis takes the big glucose molecule and converts it down to pyruvate and a little bit of ATP. Stage 2, the pyruvate oxidation and citric acid cycle, takes that pyruvate and converts it into acetyl-CoA. And that is a big deal because it basically supplies the electrons to stage 3. And then stage 3 is the oxidative phosphorylation, which involves the electron transport chain that we just talked about. And this is the stage that produces the most ATP. A little note here is that the citric acid cycle does also produce ATP, and all of this is kind of done through a chemiosmosis process. So basically that potential energy in that hydrogen ion concentration gradient, because through all these processes, you're going to be getting these hydrogen ions. They're going to be getting concentrated. And then they are what is used to drive the production of ATP, especially at the end there. And we will talk about that when we get into a little bit more in depth of that oxidative phosphorylation stage. So let's talk about glycolysis. So for the entire conversation here where we're talking about the stages of cellular respiration, remember they do connect to each other, and we are always going to be talking about this is per one glucose molecule. You will see some diagrams where it's just taking like one pyruvate, but you have to remember that one glucose molecule becomes 2 pyruvate molecules. So anything for one pyruvate, you have to multiply by 2 because we're talking about one glucose molecule. All of these numbers are figured out per glucose molecule, not per any of the other smaller molecules that are used in this entire process. So glycolysis will net 2-ATP through substrate level phosphorylation, which basically means that this production of ATP needs an enzyme. So whereas later we're going to see a different sort of ATP that's driven through that hydrogen ion concentration gradient, this production of ATP, there's a specific enzyme that the organic substrate will bind to, and things will change around and you'll get the adenosine triphosphate at the end. But we're not going to get very in-depth into that. A little note here is everything we talk about, the book does go into a little more depth in, but for all of the entry-level bio classes I have taken, I've pretty much watered this down to what I remember needing to know then. Glycolysis has basically 9 steps. Steps 1 to 4 require the input of ATP, so that's the energy investment phase. You need ATP to start breaking things down and getting things going. And then steps 5 through 9 produce ATP, which is the energy payoff phase. And throughout these steps, there's many intermediate molecules, meaning there's many different molecules that are produced and broken down to get from 1 glucose to the 2 pyruvate molecules we see at the bottom of this diagram. So what we also see here is, in the end, you net out 2 ATP, and then you also get 2 NADH and 2 hydrogen ions. That's important because the NADH is going to then help out with that electron transport chain later, and the hydrogen ions help build that ion concentration gradient. And I'm saying it nets 2 ATP because while glycolysis does make 4 ATP, remember you have that energy investment phase. So it also uses 2 ATP at the beginning. So 4 minus the 2 used, 2. You net 2 ATP overall for glycolysis per 1 glucose molecule. Once that pyruvate is done with the glycolysis step, it's going to move over to the step 2, which is pyruvate oxidation and the citric acid cycle. So pyruvate oxidation is fairly straightforward. You take that pyruvate and it gets transferred over and transformed into acetyl-CoA. And acetyl-CoA is the molecule that is necessary to enter the citric acid cycle. It's important to note here that the pyruvate oxidation is where you get the carbon dioxide as a waste product, and you also end up with more NADH and more hydrogen ions. So notice here that in our little diagram, we see 1 pyruvate molecule. Remember to multiply all that by 2 because you have 2 pyruvate molecules per glucose molecule. But acetyl-CoA is a molecule that you'll probably hear a lot in biology classes, but you don't really hear much more about the structure unless you take biochemistry. And basically it's this carbon acetyl that's been slapped onto CoA, which is coenzyme A. So it's just another thing that's used, and the CoA will come off once the acetyl-CoA does enter the citric acid cycle. And the citric acid cycle has 6 steps, and it ends up netting 2 ATP. And it also produces those necessary electron carriers. So you get the NADH and another electron carrier, FADH2. However, NADH is much more involved in cellular respiration than FADH2. And then you also get more carbon dioxide released during this as well, because as these molecules are becoming smaller, if you'll notice, pyruvate is a 3-carbon molecule, which you can see with the 3 little gray balls in the diagram. And then 1 carbon gets cut off. Acetyl-CoA has the 2 carbons that are attached to that coenzyme A. And so once you get those electrons being carried away by FADH2 and NADH, you're going to begin to enter the oxidative phosphorylation. And the diagram here is really great from the book. I made it small because the wording is kind of busy. But the whole gist of this is that these electrons are going to move through that transport chain, which are represented by these fun little proteins embedded in a membrane here. And this hydrogen gradient is going to drive the ATP synthase, which ATP synthase is that molecule that produces or synthesizes ATP. And that's the one at the far right, and it's kind of like a pump here. The hydrogen ions go in, cycle through, it turns, ADP and phosphate go in, ATP comes out. And then you're also going to get the water produced. And then for oxidative phosphorylation, you get 28 ATP produced per glucose molecule. So if you add it up, you get that 2 ATP from glycolysis, 2 ATP from the citric acid cycle, 28 ATP from oxidative phosphorylation, for a total of 32 ATP. Overall, cellular respiration, again, is an aerobic process, meaning it's in the presence of oxygen, which is why you get that water release and all of that fun stuff, because oxygen is necessary. Now, there is another way that cells can harvest energy if they're in a low oxygen environment for one reason or another that does not require oxygen, and this is through fermentation. And again, fermentation is basically harvesting energy without the presence of oxygen. And like cellular respiration, it begins with glycolysis. Remember that glycolysis didn't require oxygen, and none of the waste products from glycolysis produced oxygen carrying molecules. Glycolysis is pretty much the first step for energy harvesting because, again, at its core, you're breaking glucose down to pyruvate. And there's 2 big types of fermentation we need to touch on. The first one is lactic acid fermentation, which basically, at the end of the day, produces lactate. And this is a thing that can be done by muscle cells. And it's very helpful because in a low oxygen environment during heavy workout, your cells are still producing the energy they need to work, but then you get a buildup of that lactate, and that can cause other problems. But again, no oxygen is required, but it will net less ATP than cellular respiration. The other one is going to be alcohol fermentation, which our cells cannot do. And it produces ethanol and also releases carbon dioxide. And this you can see a lot in little organisms like yeast. And the big picture here is, again, it produces 2 ethanol per glucose molecule. The lactic acid fermentation produces 2 lactate per glucose molecule. So that's about as in-depth as we're going to get into fermentation. Most biology classes kind of mention that they're a thing. You need to know what each one produces and if it can happen in muscle cells or if like humans can't do it. So that's pretty much what you need to know unless you're studying fermentation and microbes. Before we wrap up here, I am going to bring in this idea that all these metabolic pathways do connect. So while carbohydrates like glucose are the easiest molecules to enter into cellular respiration because they are the first molecule of glycolysis, other molecules can be transformed and enter as an intermediate into the whole process. So things like fats and proteins can be converted into these intermediate molecules within the whole overall process of cellular respiration to enter that pathway and be used as energy. So it's not like you can only get energy through eating carbs like glucose. Like, obviously, all the food you eat can be transferred to energy. It's just there's a little more steps involved. But we're not going to get super into that here because that's more of a biochemistry concept and breaking down of molecules and other enzymes. And also, these organic molecules that you're getting from food aren't exclusively used for energy. They're also used as the raw materials for biosynthesis, which is what your body does to produce these other things that you need to live. So producing the other amino acids and proteins that you need to build up muscles and other things that bodies do. So just keep that in mind. And things like fats and proteins will net overall less ATP because they're not coming in at the beginning of that process as glucose. They're coming in later as an intermediate. And if you're looking at this figure, you can see there's a pathway for them to enter pretty much at any level of cellular respiration except for that last oxidative phosphorylation phase. They can enter in during glycolysis as an intermediate, during the acetyl-CoA transfer into the citric acid cycle, or enter in as another citric acid cycle intermediate. Again, the book did go into more detail about glycolysis and the citric acid cycle than I did, but I did cut out some sections that were just connection sections as well, because the whole idea of this video was to kind of go over the big picture, what you would need to know to pass your cellular respiration exam in a very entry-level bio class. If anyone is interested, I'm more than happy to go into more detail about any of these processes, but frankly, you're probably never going to need to go super in-depth in them unless you're a biology major or you're taking a biochemistry class. Because even then, if you get into these processes, you need to know even more in biochemistry. But again, overall, big picture, this has just kind of been the gist of cellular respiration and give you a little more idea of what is going on. So I will release you now. If you made it this far in the video, good on you, because it's been kind of a heavy, boring topic, and I understand that this video was long, but we were tackling the whole chapter because there's no logical place to break this up, and I think the sections that the book made were stupid. So until next time, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you. Thank you again for watching this video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and ring that bell if you would like to see more. And if you'd like to follow me on any of my other social medias, the links are down in the description below. Don't forget to check out thereptilegoth.com for all of my articles and blog posts. If you found any value in this video and you would like to help support the channel, please check out my Patreon page. That link is also in the description down below. And a special thanks goes out to my Diamond Dragon patron, Diane B. What you're doing is really helping me fund a dream here. I will see you guys all in the next one.